And thank you for your good work, Lindsey, in coming up with an idea which I think is important for the deliberations here in Washington in the period ahead, which is we're all focused, every one of us, every day, on what emanates from Trump Tower in New York. The comings, the goings, the disappointments, the joys, the ecstasy,
Wow.
and then some of the recriminations. That's politics, and those of us who've been part of political processes kind of get that. And then underneath that, what shape do we make of the likely direction of US policy to the world at large, the Russian Federation, China, the wider Asia-Pacific region? What will be the priorities emerging? And that is all important, and particularly on this day when we see the announcement of the proposed appointment of the new Secretary of State. And assuming his confirmation, of course, all people of goodwill would wish him well. That's one half of the equation. As the great axiom of global politics, deep theory of international relations that I've always adhered to is simply expressed in these terms: it takes two to tango. And the other part of the tango here is the region. And within that, there are multiple tangos going on between the United States and countries with which has had a close allied relationship for a long time, relationships of friendship and partnership with other countries, and other countries with whom it has a heightening degree of strategic competition. So our purpose here today is to try and harness this latter set of views, latter set of perspectives, because understanding how partners in the region think and why they think that way is in fact the beginning of wisdom, because it sets the terrain within which United States policy will operate. And the terrain is not just there to be mown down, the terrain is there to be engaged with all the complex politics, national and intra-regional, which the Asia-Pacific region represents. And so I commend to your attention this book that we have put together with many fine folks from across the region. We know many of them. They serve as our senior fellows, members of our advisory board, members of our board of trustees, and others. But we've asked them to put their thinking caps on as immediately past national security advisors or foreign ministers and the like, to put themselves in the view of their national governments as to what they would hope and expect of an incoming US administration, including its current political personality, which is that of Donald Trump. Of course, if you go through the region writ large, we already see, and we're barely a month or so in, and barely a month or so out from the inauguration, emerging patterns. If I move from north to south at the moment, if you're sitting in Pyongyang, let me start with a view which may not automatically be on the tip of our tongues here. What would be the view in Pyongyang right now in terms of this new Trump administration? What would they expect, anticipate? Will Kim Jong-un seek to test this administration? And if so, for what reasons? What are the emerging views in Seoul, given recent tumultuous domestic political circumstances? Those of us who come from similar political systems and democracies know what that's like. But what does Seoul now expect in terms of being a trade-dependent and trade-intensive economy from the future, as John Negroponte indicated before, given President-elect Trump's view on the future of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Korea is not a party to, but more broadly, where trade liberalization or the reverse goes to in the wider region. Let's hop across the Sea of Japan to our friends in Tokyo and ask, how is it being seen from there? We know Shinzo Abe was quick off the mark, off to Trump Tower, the first foreign leader, so empowered by his cabinet. Smart move by our Japanese friends. And from his engagement with President Trump, had the result of positive statements about the reaffirmation of the relationship and the strategic alliance between Japan and the United States. But the deep questioning in the back of the Japanese mind is, what does this mean in terms of the future dynamics of the US-China relationship? What does it mean in terms of the future management of the DPRK? And given that Shinzo Abe have expended so much political capital on getting this thing called the TPP through Japanese domestic politics, where does that leave me in terms of future trade liberalization? Rich and deep questions as seen from the Tokyo perspective. Moving back across the Sea of Japan and landing in Beijing, there is more than a little scratching of the head occurring as we speak here today. None of us quite anticipated that this US-China relationship would actually go back to such fundamental questions as the one-China policy so early. But it has, with statements by President-elect Trump, tweeted and then commented on in his remarks on Fox News just yesterday. And this has led to initially a muted response from Beijing, but progressively a sharper response from Beijing. And the question on most people's minds is the actual fundamental construct of the one China policy now, in Beijing's perception of Washington, on the table, as opposed to being an assumed foundation for everything else that is discussed within that relationship. Moving to Southeast Asia, an important relationships there which the United States has, and the virtue of having my good friend Ashok, who I've known over many years, is one of Singapore's most experienced ambassadors around the world. Deep and I think region-wide questions about US staying power in broader Southeast Asia and beyond. Having been through the recent experience of the proclaimed pivot and rebalance, has that been substantiated, or as our Southeast Asian contributor, our Singaporean contributor to this book, former Ambassador Chan Heng Chi, has said eloquently in her memorandum within this report, will the United States be substantively engaged in the region in security and economic terms in the future, or are we beginning to see that ebb away? And do countries in the region therefore begin to think that the geostrategic circumstances are changing under their feet? A very important essay. And let me just conclude with moving a little west to, of course, India. I've looked at the campaign statements from President-elect Trump on India. There are not many there. But I also have seen something of the emerging chemistry of the relationship. It would seem at one level to be positive. Where this goes to in terms of the future of the Indian democracy, the strategic re-engagement or engagement for the first time at a comprehensive level in Washington's strategic partnership with Delhi through the Obama administration, it's an open question. It would seem from Delhi's perspective, that it could find a constructive modus vivendi, both in security and in economic terms, from a Trump administration. The former National Security Advisor of India is Shiv Shankar Menon, is our author on the paper in this. Please read it. It's a very good and sharp piece, and asking this question from Delhi's perspective, a request for the United States to continue to provide the fundamental underpinnings of Asia-Pacific security in the future as what he describes as a benign hegemon, and then goes on to say, and we in Delhi will be looking at what American trade policy means for the economic emergence of India as a new great economic power. These are rich sets of questions posed by the themes outlined in this volume. Enough from me. Some opening comments from you, Ashok, on how the Trump administration and how Southeast Asian and Singapore's expectations of a Trump administration are seen through your own eyes.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here to join this very distinguished panel with my old friend Kevin and my colleagues from Australia and Korea. I want to congratulate the Asia Pacific Policy Institute led by Kevin, Wendy, Cutler, and of course Lindsey for this work that they've put together, because I would commend you all to go through these essays because there are common themes that you can pull across. Kevin's run through some of these regional perspectives that you have. But the one common theme you get through all these essays, and it's a common theme, particularly in Southeast Asia, is about the continued U.S. global leadership role. And that has been fundamental to how Southeast Asia sees the incoming Trump administration. There is some sense of anticipation. Changes of administration always bring some changes in strategy, some rethinking of policies, some recalibration of policies, and we expect this. We would have expected this no matter who won the election. And I think we need to give the incoming Trump administration that space so that they have an opportunity in order to pull through these threads of the strategy as they want to develop over the next 4 years. But in that process, I think U.S. global leadership role is something that is fundamental to the success of the Asia-Pacific. And it is something that the region would really like to see continue and remain very consistent. It is not unique to just the previous administration or the outgoing administration. This U.S. global leadership role has really stretched since the Second World War, since the 1950s and 1960s, and really helped shape a world in the region that is beneficial to the United States. It's opened up avenues for U.S. companies to operate in trade and investments. It has provided security structures for the United States to protect itself. And you can see this most vividly in the transformation of Singapore. Singapore celebrated 50 years of diplomatic relations with the United States this year. And you see the transformation of Singapore over the past 50 years. It has been a transformation very dependent on a very strong and active U.S. relationship in the region. It has opened up new markets for Singapore companies. It's opened up new opportunities for U.S. companies to operate, to create investments and jobs around the region. Singapore was the first Asian country to sign a free trade agreement with the United States more than 10 years ago, one in which the U.S. in fact has a surplus. And it was really the building block to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Ambassador Negroponte spoke about, that Singapore has been a very active partner in. Singapore is also part of a partner of the U.S. in terms of security relationship around the region. So you see this transformation of the U.S. role around the region, particularly in its relationship with Singapore. Where we are today, representing Southeast Asia, and my predecessor wrote an essay in this, Southeast Asia operates in a very unique space in terms of U.S. relations in the Asia-Pacific. And in this particular unique space is U.S.-China relationship, which Kevin touched upon. Southeast Asia operates in the space that is created in the calm of U.S.-China relationship. I think it's very important to understand where that U.S. role is as far as the geopolitical changes of the rise of China. China offers great opportunities for countries of the region. It offers great trading and investment opportunities in the United States. What we would like to see is a continued relationship that manages strategically an open area for the space for countries of ASEAN to operate in. ASEAN played a very important role in particular over the past year or so in terms of the U.S. engagement with Asia. There was a Sunnyland Summit earlier this year. The previous administration has engaged actively with ASEAN, and we would like to see that really continue. Because one thing that is important for Southeast Asia is continued active presence coming to the region. We would watch, as Lindsey said, very closely where the incoming Secretary of State decides to travel out to. We will, of course, welcome President Trump when he's inaugurated to visit the region. There are structures, architectures in the region that allow space for the U.S. President to come regularly. The East Asia Summit will be hosted by Manila in 2017. The APEC meeting will be hosted by Vietnam. These are regularly attended by the U.S. President. And we would like to see the U.S. President attend this and lay out really what he sees as a strategy for dealing with Asia in that future. And one very important part of this strategy of dealing with Asia, again taking from Ambassador Negroponte, is trade. There have to be economic arrangements, whether it is TPP or some structure that is a multilateral economic arrangement in the Asia-Pacific. And we're looking forward to seeing what the Trump administration comes up with as they deal with this region, both overall in terms of security, but also in terms of trade relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Ambassador Ahn, the view from Seoul.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Well, I wish to make 3 quick points. My first point would be unconditional endorsement of what we just heard from Ashok. And then well, he was making 3 or 4 points, but he won. I would like to endorse with full force would be what he said about the importance of continuity in U.S. leadership. And then let us just remind ourselves of one of the commemoration we had last week. That was 75th commemoration of Pearl Harbor. That, in my mind, fell on Wednesday last week, and then there was one occasion for me to think once again about the importance of U.S. leadership wherever in the world, but in particular in Asia. Why do I say that? Because, again, I totally agree with Ashok in the sense that let us just think about the meaning of the past 70 years we lived through together. That is to say, unique period of peace, stability, and prosperity over the past 70 years. And then that, in fact, would become even more conspicuous if we just put it against the backdrop of 5,000 of human history. Let us just think in long term. If we just put this 50 years of our common experiences against 5,000 years of human history, this uniqueness of this peace, stability, and prosperity really stands out. Then how was it possible? I think it was possible because of the architecture we built together for security, for international economy, and then for all those institutions like IMF, IBRD, GET/WTO, etc., etc. But at the same time, let us just think about who was behind all this architecture and then institutions. There was you, the United States of America. But at the same time, this is what Ashok said in the sense that all countries in Northeast Asia, we benefited enormously out of this architecture. All countries in Southeast Asia, we benefited enormously out of this architecture. But all countries in Oceania also benefited enormously out of this architecture. But at the same time, this is what Ashok said, which is it was not only us in Asia which benefited, it was also the United States which benefited from this architecture. So that, in fact, was the first point made by Ashok, and then which I just wish to endorse unconditionally. My second point, that is about your question, Kevin, which is about trade, international economy. Then let us just think about it. This is what the Ambassador Negroponte said, which is the short term and the long term. And then Ambassador Negroponte said the relations between United States and Asia, it goes back to 200 years. And then let us just think about trade. And then let us just think about wealth of nations. Wealth of nations, there was Adam Smith, that was in 1776. Somehow it just happened on the same year of American Declaration of Independence, 1776. And then we, in fact, one of the things we experienced through this election, presidential election campaign, there was surge in anti-trade emotion, surge in anti-globalization emotion, but at the same time, the reason why I think Ambassador Negroponte is absolutely right when he says that we should be thinking not only short term, but also long term, it is because this definitely is not the first time that we are experiencing this anti-trade emotions over the past 200 years. 1776, then he laid it out very clear. In my mind, Adam Smith answered all the questions. But even then, from time to time, we had to deal with anti-trade emotions from time to time. One such particular occasion I remember, it is 90s. If you recall, in fact, there were certain anti-trade emotions at the time as well. Korea joined OECD in 1996. When Korea joined, then I just happened to work for the Korean mission to the OECD. And I said to myself, it's very, very funny in the sense that most important project going on at the OECD at the time was a project to, in a sense, proselytize the benefits of trade and investment liberalization. So Korea was a new member. Wendy remembers it, right? Wendy used to represent United States admirably during that period of time at the OECD meetings. And then I, in fact, came to speak to the Director for International Trade at OECD Secretariat, whose name was Dr. Abel. And then I told him, I don't understand benefits of trade and investment liberalization. Wasn't it sufficiently answered 200 years ago by somebody called Adam Smith? Why do you have to spend so much money? Why do you have to spend so much resources on something which has been answered more than sufficiently 200 years ago? And then Dr. Abel, I still remember what he said. Dr. Abel said, well, politics. in the sense that, well, I know the benefits of trade and investment liberalization, but at the same time, politics is not necessarily in support of trade for the time being. So that's the reason why we are spending so much OECD asset, in proselytizing once again what has been proven, as you said, more than sufficiently 200 years ago. So my point is this, which is that, well, I'm concerned about this anti-trade emotion. I'm concerned about anti-globalization emotion. But at the same time, let us just try to put in long-term perspective. And then well, I think it will go away in due course. Why? Because, well, that's the fact. The fact is trade, globalization, that in fact is beneficial in the long term for each and every one of us. So that is my second point. My third point, there is about one point which has been raised by Kevin, which is Korea undergoing domestic political turmoil for the time being. And then it is political turmoil, but at the same time, let me make 2 points about that, which is that, first of all, everything is playing out in a very peaceful and orderly manner. And then every weekend there are about 2 million people who get together in order to put up this public rally. Have you heard of any rally which in fact put together 2 million people all at the same time? So that's amazing, but at the same time, what is even more amazing for me is not a clash with the police. 2 million people, not a clash with the police. And then maybe this is something which is not known to you, which is that when they leave, 2 million people leave the streets, there is not a waste on the street. They just pick up all the waste and they put it in their pocket. Maybe this is not known
Very
to
Korean.
you. Right.
We would call that un-Australian activity.
Right. And then my second sub-point on Korean political turmoil would be this, which is that, well, Lindsey, thank you for your kind introduction. I spent almost 38 years in Korean public service, and I joined it in 1978. And then I just called back 38 years of my public service. And then what I think is this, which is that it seems to be the case we are meeting with major crises every 10 years. Back in 87, we had the democratic revolution. Did the system fail? No. It, in fact, met with or led to very important political reform in Korea. Now there is no other country as democratic as Korea for the time. 1997 with Asian financial crisis, it was as bad as, let me just tell you about the exchange rate. $1 was 800 won. In several days' time, it shot up to $1 to 2,000 won. Did it lead to the failure of the Korean economic system? No. We, in fact, took advantage of that opportunity, introduced large measures of reform, and then, in fact, structurally, it developed into far better functioning economy. That's what happened in 1997. 2008, global financial crisis. 2016, this domestic turmoil. So, Ambassador Negroponte, thank you. Long-term and short-term, when I think about long-term, then I feel pretty good about what is happening in the United States, in Korea, as well as across the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for wise words which form a basis for optimism, if we take the broad view. My friend and former parliamentary colleague and political adversary, Joe Hockey. We started out on television together back in the Mesolithic period, having morning debates on Australian television. Joe has been Australian ambassador here since the beginning of the year and is doing a great job for Australia. Joe.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And how ironic it is, 20 years on television together, and we're in a different stage with a smaller audience, but another side of the world. But ambassadors in the audience and everywhere else, I'm going to take it. I'm not a born diplomat like many of the people here are. I'm a little more frank than that, but I'm going to take a little lesson and refer back to history to understand better what the challenges are from both of my colleagues up here. I'm going to go back a few thousand years, and I asked people to think carefully about when was there ever a major global power that countries actually wanted to join with rather to share the same values. and instead of that country, that imperial power, being an invader. Which country on earth has become the global superpower over that period of time because of its values and others wanting to share those values? And the only country that I can identify, and I would stand to be corrected, is the United States, where there's been this gravitational pull to the United States over the last 100 years because its values have been the values that the rest of the world wants to share. Not all countries, but a lot of countries. Freedom of navigation, freedom of speech, freedom of enterprise, democracy, robust and broad and deep. All of those things, combined with a whole lot of other values, have been the very fundamental basis upon which America has become great. In fact, just a few weeks' time, it'll be 99 years since Woodrow Wilson went up the hill to the Capitol and laid down his 14-point plan upon which America would engage and, in fact, lead the world during the 20th century and beyond. And there were two key articles in that 14-point plan that are as relevant in Asia today as they were back then. Articles 2 and 3, which argue for freedom of navigation, how important that is in the South China Sea, and freedom of trade. Woodrow Wilson said this is the basis upon which America will engage with the world and mobilise 4 million people in World War I. The population of Australia was 5 million. And on short notice, America mobilised 4 million people. And during its period of isolationism, America was a massive debtor to the world, and then it became a creditor when it decided to engage with the world. And indeed, over the last 99 years, America has become great because it's engaged with the world, with the economic powerhouses of the world in particular. Now, I've always had a view that you give public support and private advice. So I'm not going to break that rule up here. But I'm entirely consistent with everyone else up here that there can't be any ambiguity about what you believe in if you are the world's superpower. You just can't be inconsistent. You can't be doubtful. And that's what America has been over the last few months. So the transition and the nature of the transition really does matter. The fact that there is a very close dialogue between the current president and the incoming president is hugely important. It's reassuring for the American people. It should be reassuring for the world. Secondly, from an Asia perspective, America has to engage with Asia if it is going to be great. It has no choice. 2/3 of the world's economic growth is coming out of Asia. So it has to engage. You've seen this massive transformation in the Asian economy that is driving not only global trade, but importantly, a transformation that is lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over a few years. Now, we're going to see at least 500 million people emerge in the middle class in Asia, additional 500 million over the next 10 years. And what that means is consumption. So if you want American manufacturing to turn into American exports, to turn into consumption in Asia, you need to engage with Asia and trade with Asia. There is no choice, because the biggest consumer class in the history of humanity is going to appear in Asia over the next 15 years. It is also going to be a military hotbed, whether we like it or not. Half the world's submarines are going to be located in the Asia-Pacific region by the middle of this century. There is a military build-up in the Asian region, whether we like it or not. And the fact is, the United States has 150,000 young American men and women buried in the sand between Australia and North Asia. Now, I don't see America being great if it's going to abandon not only its history, but those that died fighting for the values that Asian countries want to share. So frankly, I share the optimism It is because of necessity. It will engage with the Asian Pacific region, whether it's described as a pivot or a rebalance, or whether it is simply about the expression of power associated with individual interests. I have no doubt that the United States will continue to be engaged with Asia, because if it wants to be great again, to use the term used by the President-elect, even though I believe it is great as it is, but if it is going to want to be great again, it has no choice. The fundamental question in my mind is, how does that express itself? And we have a role to play in helping to raise awareness levels. There is a danger in politics that there is assumed knowledge in the media, in the community. There is a danger in politics, and particularly in a fast-moving world, that there is an assumed understanding of what other parties are interested in. You can never assume that. And someone once said to me, McDonald's spends about $200 million a year promoting hamburgers. How much do you spend promoting policy? And it's a good question to ask. I think there's why do I say that? Because everything is retail. Everything is retail in this world. And what we've got to do as a collective interest in the Asia-Pacific region, whether it be on TPP or on the rebalance, or be it simply on a day-to-day basis, is to spend more time explaining how the Asian region can help to make not only America great, but to make humanity great over the next 10, 20 and 30 years' time.
Thank you, Joe, and straight from the heart. It's some pretty consistent themes emerging from our ambassadorial panelists. I've heard a key thematic, which is a call for strategic continuity in terms of US leadership in the region. Parallel to that, in part in Joe's earlier comments, but reflected elsewhere, a call not for any US administration and the Trump administration not to disengage globally or regionally, citing the example of what happened with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points in the interwar period. Thirdly, and growing from that, a call, I think, from the ambassadors collectively about the fundamental importance of maintaining open trade, free trade, and the arteries of free trade as well. America benefits from that, the world benefits from that, the region benefits from that. A fourth one I've picked up, and this is a phrase I heard from Ashok, but I thought it was well worth repeating because it will permeate some of our discussion, I believe. But in Southeast Asia, but I believe it applies more broadly, that development and peace within that region occur through the prism of strategic calm between the United States, or in the shadow, I think is the term you used, or in the wake of space of strategic calm between the United States and China, and I presume the converse applies as well. And then there's a very practical point in terms of the incoming administration. Where you visit first and who you visit matters. We know this as Australians, as part of the Asia-Pacific region, that our neighbours across the region place a huge priority, not just for reasons of face, though that is part of it, but for reasons of a demonstration of priority about where the United States sees its future priorities in this region relative to others. And thank you, Ambassador Negroponte. I know you have to be elsewhere. Let me just probe this with a question to each ambassador before we open it up. Ashok, looking at one of your distinguished predecessors' comments in this book, Heng Chi says that, talking about the Philippines actually, while the Philippines has been more open and dramatic about the switch in its orientation and mindset, referring to President Duterte's recent visit to China, In reality, some ASEAN states have been realigning towards China in different degrees and for quite some time. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Brunei, Malaysia, and she says have all moved into the Chinese orbit without fanfare. These are very direct observations. Goes on to say that ASEAN countries, however, want to engage with all major powers in the world, and in particular to enjoy a good relationship with both the United States and China, echoing your point. So on your proposition about space being created as a consequence of the calm in US-China relations, your reflections on which way we're now headed and what that means for freedom of strategic maneuver by our friends in Southeast Asia.
Well, Heng Chi as a former ambassador has more latitude than I would have as a current serving ambassador to sort of put countries in terms of where they shift. But I think that no country in Southeast Asia, or for that matter, the whole region, including Australia and New Zealand, would want to have difficult relationships with either China or the United States. Most of us in the region, if not all of us in Southeast Asia, have China as our number one or number two trading partner. And that's a reality. That's a beneficial reality. Chinese tourists are traveling across the region. They bring huge value. Chinese companies are operating in the region. Our products get sold in Chinese markets. Singapore companies invest in China. Chinese companies invest in Singapore. And this happens across the region. So it is a good relationship that we want to preserve. Similarly, we all have good relationships with the United States. The United States may have fallen off in terms of being the number one or number two trading partner for most of us, but it's usually in the top 5 or top 10. It also provides, it's not just traditional trade, it is services. Go around Southeast Asia and you will see US companies operating as if they are local companies. There's a Starbucks at every corner. There's a McDonald's down every street. Everyone carries an iPhone or a Google Android in their pockets. So that's where the relationships are. Now, whether there are adjustments along the way, as you know, Heng Chi may suggest, the Philippines has made certain adjustments under the new president. I think these are natural as a consequence of where they need to operate and maintain relationships with both sides. What is important, I think, in Southeast Asia is for the US to be present. And we have created structures for the US to be present with the Chinese together. The East Asia Summit, the APEC Leaders Meeting, the ASEAN Regional Forum, these become platforms that even if foreign ministers or prime ministers, and Kevin, you attended many of these as prime minister, may find somewhat repetitive, are useful because they're also platforms to engage your counterparts. Where else would the US and Chinese leaders meet in a calm environment except with an ASEAN forum, rather than a big bilateral summit? So I think there's a certain value of keeping this sense of ASEAN centrality and giving ASEAN countries that space in which they operate between the US and China across the Asia Pacific.
So if you're looking at ASEAN centrality and a desire to, let's call it, maintain a level of strategic calm between the 2,000-pound gorillas in the front room, that's China and the United States, then do you see East Asian regionalism now becoming more important as a multilateral moderating force between China and the United States? How do you see the future or desirable evolution of the East Asian Summit? Can it become something more expansive?
I would like to see it progress in that direction of shaping a better regional conversation, in a sense, among the participants of the East Asia Summit. There are already economic arrangements around this, whether you take the TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China but does not include the United States, TPP as the United States but without China, whether we're talking about the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. I think that the more opportunities we provide for leaders to engage on things and deal with larger security issues in the region, not just security issues, issues like climate change. Where do you deal with these issues? These are not just bilateral issues between the US and China. These are regional and global issues that have to be dealt with. And in that, I think having the East Asia Summit providing a framework that says we would like to see some movement across many of these areas. There are, in the East Asia Summit agenda, aside from what the leaders speak about, there are issues like education. How do we share educational standards and educational knowledge. There are lots of areas that we can substantiate into the East Asia framework, but without necessarily creating a new organization. I think that's where a lot of hesitancy comes in. The region operates, and sometimes the United States has this sense that they like to make things neat and even. The region operates with a great deal of complexity. We like these noodles of relationships across trade relations. We don't want to necessarily answer one or the other. They're not black and white. They're not binary. And I think that partners have to understand we are operating in this space and using that space quite effectively.
It's a very keen observation about what is often the Anglo-Saxon disease of wanting strategic neatness when the cultural wisdoms and traditions of the region often suggest something a little less defined. And the ASEAN way, I think, historically has had much to offer, which often, I think, as we reflect on American mindsets, is problematic. American presidents go to meetings in East Asia, they expect 4 results against 3 talking points and 4 sub-dot points, so that we go tick, tick, cross, cross, tick, tick. That ain't the way in the neighborhood, as our friends in ASEAN have experienced in the slow evolution of their regional machinery over many decades. Ambassador Ashok just mentioned RCEP and TPP. As I said before, Korea, of course, was not a party to TPP, but was looking for accession arrangements. Given that TPP has now gone the way of the dinosaurs, it seems, is something resurrectable from TPP? What do you see as the real potential for RCEP? Is there a Korean view of this? The Korean paper in here specifically speaks about the future of trading arrangements in the region. Your thoughts?
Well, when it comes to TPP, then of course the difference between RCEP and then TPP is that where in TPP there is the United States, and RCEP there is not the presence of the United States, which reminds me of the genesis of APEC. And then I totally agree with Ashok once again about the importance of institutionalization. Institutionalization, why is it important? It is because there are certain objectives that they should be fulfilled by establishing all those institutions. But at the same time, equally important is that they provide an opportunity for the leaders of our region to get together. So in that sense, I was extremely glad about this emergence of APEC. And then I have to compliment our Australian friends in the sense that there was Prime Minister Bob Hawke back in 1989. And then with that, this leadership coming from our Prime Minister Bob Hawke and then more broadly Australians, then I do not think that APEC would be there today. So that is the reason why I was extremely encouraged when, in fact, APEC was emerging back in 1989. Then I should be thanking Ashok in the sense that Ashok just used the expression of ASEAN centrality. And then one of the things from which we, the countries in Northeast Asia, benefited enormously was out of something called ASEAN Plus procedure. That is to say, ASEAN began to invite countries in Northeast Asia. ASEAN, if you remember, then of course there are 10 countries in Southeast Asia. And then there is certain geographic split between Northeast Asia and then Southeast Asia. And then ASEAN, one of the very smart things that the ASEAN began to do was that to invite countries in Northeast Asia. They invited China, they invited Korea, they invited Japan. So that's how started ASEAN Plus process. That is to say, ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus Korea, ASEAN plus Japan. And what happened was the leaders coming from those countries, 3 countries in Northeast Asia, they began to congregate on the occasion of ASEAN Plus procedure. So what happened was they began to meet with each other. That is to say, leaders coming from those 3 countries in Northeast Asia, they began to meet with each other, which in fact prepared a ground for them to come up with their own summit process. That's what happened back in 2008. So it was only from 2008 the summit process among 3 countries in Northeast Asia started. So that is the reason why I think once again I agree with Ashok when he says ASEAN centrality, and then ASEAN has played a very important role. But at the same time, I should be thanking Kevin, you, about this very important role you played for the emergence of G20 process. When G20 process started back in, of course, global financial crisis of 2008, then many of you would still remember Sarkozy, President Sarkozy of France, coming to speak at the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, That was in September 2008. What did he say? What he said was that this, in fact, is a financial crisis of global dimension. G7, that is too small. There must be something larger. That's what Sarkozy said. I was listening to him, and I said, if it should be larger, then it must be G20. Because at that time, there was a lot of genealogy, geology, G7, G8, G10, G13, G18, G20, etc., etc. And then let me be frank with you. The only G where Korea found its place, that was G20. So I said, it must be G20. and then the way it turned out, it was the G20. And then the thing is, Kevin, you just mentioned about Anglo-Saxon tradition or Anglo-Saxon wisdom. And then Korea, in fact, hosted G20 summit meeting. That was in November 2010. And then if you recall, that was the first non-Anglo-Saxon capital which hosted the G20 process. But at the same time, the reason why I should be thanking Kevin is because at the time, Kevin used to be the prime minister, and how it turned out to be G20 rather than G something else. It was because we didn't know it at the time. But later on, we came to find that our instruction, Australian instruction, it was exactly the same thing. That is to say, we approached all the G7 countries and then we said, it must be G20. Why? Because there was something called G20 finance ministers process, which started back in 1998 on the occasion of Asian financial crisis. So Kevin, I wonder if you remember the instruction. The instruction was, the common instruction we had between Australia and Korea was, let us not just try to invent another vehicle. Let us just use the vehicle we already have, that is the G20 finance ministers process. Let us just elevate it to the level of the leaders. That's what happened. And then, of course, Kevin, he was not only behind the emergence of G20, but at the same time, he, in fact, was a star player in the G20 process as a Prime Minister of Australia. Just before coming over here, then we were chatting among the panelists, and I reminded Kevin about a very smart comment he made at the time when he was the Prime Minister. But he said, when the economy grows, it goes up like an escalator. When it comes down like an elevator. Do you get the image, right? And then is it a clear image you have how economy grows and then clashes? That's what Kevin said back in 2008, and I still remember it. How do I remember it? Because at the time I used to be G20 shopper. And then why?
Sorry.
Why do I say all of that? It's because, once again, I just complimented all three gentlemen sitting on the panel for a good reason, but at the same time, the reason why I'm doing it is because Korea is a strong believer in institutionalization. And then whether it is TPP, whether it is RCEP, or whether it's something larger, there is something larger called FTA, that is to say FTA for all countries in Asia Pacific. And then if we put TPP and then RCEP together, then it will be FTA, right? And then the thing is, what Korea believes in, we believe in competition in liberalization. We don't mind if it is bilateral. We don't mind if it is TPP. We don't mind if it is RCEP. If, in fact, it goes in the direction of liberalization, then we will take it. That's in fact, manifestation of the depth of our confidence in the benefits of liberalization. But at the same time, that is the reason why, when it comes to TPP, of course, we very much hope that TPP will in fact, progress in all the 12 negotiating countries. If it doesn't, then maybe. So if certain modification would be necessary, then of course we'll be very glad to observe it, and at the same time, come and join it. And the same thing should be said with respect to RCEP as well as FTA. But I should give credit to where it is due in the sense that this expression, competition in liberalization, that comes from Robert Zeller. And then Wendy knows it only too well. Thank you.
Interesting point from the ambassador. If we're looking at TPP, RCEP, FTA. Of course, it's an alphabet soup for anyone watching this from normal civilization and society in terms of Anyone watching this through a webcast, or you just understood what I said in the last sentence, you get a free bucket of lollies from the Asia Society. But essentially, TPP had at its centre the United States. As we know, RCEP has as its centre China. Is there something to be thought through in terms of something which is broader again in terms of FTAP, taking as its core the APEC economies? Joe, let me flip back to hard security while we're going to take some questions. And I should say to the ambassadors, when we wrap up, I'll be asking each of you if you were giving 2 thoughts from the region to the Trump administration about what would be desirable for the region's future. I'll ask you in conclusion to put such propositions to the assembled throng, and we'll wait for President-elect Trump's Twitter response. But in the meantime, Joe, on the question of hard security questions, there's another document here in our booklet from the head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. It's a pretty hard-line document. He says 3 recommendations for the Trump administration. 1, it needs to reassure jittery allies of the US commitment to Asia by increasing its diplomatic and military presence, overcoming local worries that the United States undermines the region's big strategic underestimates the region's big strategic challenges and is too focused on the intractable Middle East. 2nd, the new administration must craft new language expressing US priorities and purpose in Asia rather than the haphazard use of pivot and rebalance. And finally, the administration should raise the expectations it has of its partners as well. These are very hardline comments, but your thoughts on what happens now, future direction of strategic and defence policy.
Well, hope everyone's got about 3 or 4 hours spare for this one, but I'll be very short and say that I, of course, believe there's going to be a lot of pressure on allies to lift their military spending and their intelligence spending. In the budget I delivered in 2014, we increased defence spending to 2% of GDP in Australia. We're building an entire new Navy. Effectively, we're the 2nd biggest acquirer of the Joint Strike Fighter, and we have military personnel in 31 US states. We're spending $20 million a day here. So it is, we see that as part of the heavy lifting, part of our responsibility for the strategic security of our country and our region. From our perspective, you know, one of the great causes of Japan's engagement in World War II was, of course, that trade barriers went up against Japan. It had a population that was desperately in need of raw materials. A lot of countries turned their back on Japan. Japan, unable to get it through trade, those raw materials, then sought other means. And we've got to be mindful of that, because no government can ignore the demands of its own population for prosperity. There are still hundreds of millions of people in Asia that have no electricity. And the Indian government, the Chinese government, and governments right across the region cannot ignore that demand, especially in this new day and age. And frankly, I don't think there's been enough thought given to the anti-establishment, as it's now known, movement right across the world. I mean, a lot of terrorist organisations are motivated by the fact that they are anti-establishment in nations where there is no free vote, whether it be Boko Haram or ISIL affiliates, or even Al-Qaeda, which is more anti-corruption. But the terrorist movements and cells around the world are feeding off the oxygen of anti-establishment. In Western countries, that anti-establishment, or not even Western countries, in countries around the world, that anti-establishment mood is coming through in popular votes, whether it be Brexit, which was clearly against the centralisation of British interests in the Eurozone, or be it even in votes in Colombia. Australia had an election this year. I think it's probably the case that it was the only government re-elected in the Western world this year. It was only by 1 seat. So, there is no popular vote that is ramming through any of the countries that are most familiar with broad and deep democracies at the moment. So what does that reflect? It reflects the fact that people are sick of centralisation. They feel as though the traditional institutions that have been so prevalent in their lives are no longer responding to their needs and their wants. And they're saying, I will rebel. I will rebel by voting. I will rebel by armed conflict. I will rebel whatever way I can. Through social media, being a troll, I will rebel until I feel as though the institutions that are meant to protect me, protect my job, protect my security, protect my family, properly reflect what I want. Now, I don't see centralisation as the answer. Decentralisation is very much the answer, whether it be within a country or across a region. That's why the partnerships formed between communities are the glue that is going to hold stability in a country and in a region. And frankly, the TPP, from my perspective, is more about strategic interest than it is economic interest. It is the same with a range of different arrangements around the region, Asian region, and also arrangements involving the United States. And then, if that doesn't work, the playoff is that you are going to have significant military builds-up and potential conflicts. Simple as that. It's just history repeating itself. So we've got a heavy duty to make sure that we keep the dialogue open, but importantly, not get carried away with major institutions.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Hockey. A few questions from the audience now. Those who would wish to ask a question, make sure it's a question, not a statement. Make sure it's short, and please identify yourselves. The young chap there first, and then I'll go to the lady behind. It's okay. That's you, sir. We're about to throw a microphone at you. Please catch it.
Thank you. Jack Capperell with Inside U.S. Trade. And during the run-up to the election following the conclusion of the TPP negotiations, followed many of your remarks in support of TPP very closely. My question is, if you still think that there is a chance for TPP to be revived, what about the sales pitch, essentially, do you think needs to be changed, if anything? And if you don't think that the pitch for the Trump administration to take up TPP needs to be changed, basically, why is that?
Okay, well, I think we'll take a few in sequence, and I'm going to ask one ambassador to volunteer for each question. And if you wish to ask a question, please pitch it. Help me by pitching it at an ambassador. The lady behind there first. Yes, that's you.
Thank you. My name is Zhao Ying. I'm with Hong Kong United Media. My question is for all panelists and also Mr. Rudd, if you would like to.
I only get to choose one. We've got time constraints. So.
Okay. There are several important moves between Trump and China recently, namely the Trump side call and also his comments on one China policy, and also the PLA flies aircrafts over Taiwan. Seeing all these signs, how worried are you that the strategic calm between China and the U.S. is disappearing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question. Lady in the front here, and then I'll come over to you, sir.
A follow-up on that U.S.-China relations. As you mentioned, Mr. Rudd, the fundamental issue in U.S.-China relations.
You just speak up, my friend.
It's working. Just speak. Hold it closer.
Yeah, the fundamental issue in the U.S.-China relations, that is the one China policy, is being challenged and questioned by the President-elect Trump. Do you think a Trump administration will change that one China policy? And if so, what will be the implications? And any advice you have for Beijing leaders?
Okay, that's going to be fun. The this gentleman here, I'm sorry, yeah.
Michael Davis from the University of Hong Kong and now a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. I just want to ask where human rights fits in this. The Trump administration seems not to care too much about, or at least that's the impression one gets, that they basically look at America first and, human rights around the world. I mean, I worry that human rights be damned. Is there a place, is that important in your views on how the U.S. should engage with Asia?
Good question. Thank you very much. And let me, so people don't feel too disadvantaged up the back. The lady up here with the glasses, thank you very much. Could someone hurl a microphone in that direction?
I'd like to ask my friend Ambassador An what he thinks about the discussions about trade being determined, the success of a trade agreement being determined only by whether there's a deficit.
By what?
Whether there's a trade deficit or not.
Oh, right, okay. And there was a gentleman just across from you, yes, with the white shirt. That's you, sir. That's right.
My name is Paul Tan. My question is, what are your opinions on the Chinese maneuverings in the South China Sea and their establishment of an rival bank compared to the ADB, the Asian Development Bank? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question. I heard about South China Sea, but then you went on to say something else.
I was just wondering about your thoughts on the South China Sea situation and also the establishment of the Chinese Development Bank versus the ADB. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more and then I'm going to flip it across the panel. There's a very persistent chap here, so that's you, sir.
I'm Tom Bradley, a grad student at George Mason University. For Ambassador An, given the short-term political uncertainty in the Republic of Korea and the longer-term strategic instability and provocations in North Korea, do you foresee the possibility of a strategic surprise of some sort or challenge early in the next administration? If so, what would you hope the president may consider, and what voices do you hope he will hear?
Okay, let me do it this way. There's been several questions directly, specifically to Ambassador An. The last one, Ambassador, and an earlier one, which was about
trade agreement,
trade deficit.
Yeah.
Trade deficit.
Right.
And then I'm going to also throw at you the question on human rights, given what you referred to earlier in terms of Korea's own experience. Those three there. On the question of well, let's do those three first, then we'll work out the others. Over to you.
Well, with respect to human rights, then let me just start from what Joe said, which is that what makes the United States leadership unique. And then, as a matter of fact, I always think that the United States is a great country. Again, I agree with Joe that the United States is already a great country. And then I think basically the United States is a great country for at least for three reasons. Because of its hard power, meaning economic power, military power, etc., because of its hard power. But at the same time, more importantly, because of its soft power, because of the attraction that the United States country has for almost everybody in the whole world about what the country stands for, what the United States stands for. That, I think, includes, of course, U.S. Tradition of in fact, respecting and then working for the strengthening of human rights. So I do not know what President-elect Trump has been saying or what his advisors had been saying about the human rights issue as a policy. But at the same time, I think it is just inalienable part of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, promotion of human rights and then promotion of democracy, promotion of all those fundamental values. I think that, in fact, is a deeply ingrained part of the U.S. foreign policy already. So I do not have any concern that it will continue to be the case. It will continue to be the case under. With respect to the second question, that is about the trade agreement. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for the question. And then I think, well, it was in a sense curveball for me in the sense that she, in fact, I mean, Tammy was expecting certain answer to come from me because this is what I say all the time when I have to address the question, which is that, well, let us just think about KOROS FTA. Do you want to look at the whole picture or the partial picture? And then when I say whole picture, there is trade in goods, trade in services, investment. These three pillars, they make up the KOROS FTA. And then when it comes to trade in goods, the thing is we have about $20 billion surplus vis-a-vis Korea versus the United States of America. But at the same time, $20 billion, if you look into the composition of the products being exported and imported between Korea and the United States, the products which go up very high U.S. products which go to Korea and then which going up very high. They are the products which benefit from tariff elimination. But if you look at products which are being imported from Korea into the United States, they are products which in fact has not benefited at all from tariff elimination. That I think is the reason why ITC said, were it not for Korea-US FTA, US deficit would have been larger, $15 billion larger. Instead of $20 billion, it would be $35 billion. That's about trading goods. When it comes to trading services, United States surplus is going up very rapidly. Today, it is about $11 billion. And then I'm not surprised about it in the sense that the United States, of course, it is the most efficient supplier of services wherever in the world. So I'm not surprised in the sense that the US export of services is going up very fast. So the gap is now $11 billion. Let us just think about the investment. When it comes to investment, again, there is surplus of $5 billion more coming in from Korea and into the United States. The thing is, we just checked with the employment figure of 12 largest Korean investment in the United States. Those 12 companies alone, they employed 35,000 workers. 12 companies alone, they employed 35,000 workers. And then I have to say, it is not just jobs. I have to say, so well-paying jobs in the sense that average wage of those employees, that is more than $90,000, whereas average wage for American worker is $50,000. So that, in fact, is the whole picture of KOROS FTA, and then that is the reason why I'm confident that KOROS FTA will continue to work as a kind of fundamental basis for further strengthening economic ties. About a challenge, strategic challenge, which may come along the way. Well, of course, strategic challenge, of course, that by its very nature, something which in fact would be very difficult to predict when it will happen, how it will happen. That in fact is the nature of a strategic challenge. But what is important is what we say between Korea and United States with respect to how we should be engaging North Korea is this: 3 pillars. First, pressure. Second, engagement. Third, deterrence. And I think deterrence is the most important part. Then, given the fact that the US military, that is the strongest military in the whole world. Then Korea, of course, we are the 4th or 5th largest military in the whole world. Then between the two of them, I think this combined command structure between Korea and the United States, we are ready to deal with any strategic challenge which might come our way. One last point, which is in connection with the point which has been made by Joe, which is that Joe said, Australia, it is defense spending is 2%, and then as a matter of fact, the equivalent figure for Korea is 2.6%. And then what I have to say is this, which is that when it comes to defense acquisition, that in fact is another point which should be made with respect to the trade relationship between Korea and the United States. Our defense acquisition for the past 5 years, Korea was the largest, let me emphasize, largest purchaser of defense equipment from the United States. That's according to SIPRI annual book. Korea was the largest purchaser of defense equipment.
Joe, do you want to chance your arm with AIIB and South China Sea? You led Australia's accession to the AIIB. I thought might be something for you to talk about.
Well, again, the challenge to the United States, and it's relevant to the TPP as well, is you can't lead and then not deliver as the biggest power in the world. And the AIIB was very much linked to the fact that the IMF reforms failed to pass after the United States led the push for reform of the IMF in the wake of the global financial crisis. And even though the White House was strongly supportive of that, wanted the reforms to pass through the Congress, they failed to get through. And then in the case of Asia, I mean, China came to us and others and said, well, we can't be indecisive in our region. There's a $7 trillion shortfall in infrastructure, and we want to have an Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Now, at various points, and we were working closely with Korea and all of our neighbours, Singapore, but we were driving in the negotiations outcomes that the AIIB would have appropriate processes in place to ensure that it was genuinely multilateral and it wasn't dominated by China. Now, the United States and Japan, and we haven't talked much about Japan, but I think Japan is really, I think Japan has the most at stake in the transition at the moment for various reasons, but that's for another day. The AIIB came around because the rest of the world said we've got to get on with business, and the United States chose not to participate and still not participating, and I think that's quite damaging to the US in Asia. Well, we've seen it again with the TPP. The United States was very much involved. I know Tim Grosser, who's here, Trade Minister in New Zealand, he is responsible for the TPP and was a key architect of it. But the fact that the US was very involved in leadership of it and then couldn't deliver and has chosen now not to deliver is hugely damaging to the United States' reputation in Asia. The Japanese Diet only a few days ago just passed it through, the TPP. We are progressing it through our parliament. The idea that you can renegotiate it at length is bereft of proper political thought, because I tell you what, every country that's been involved in it is giving up something. And if the United States is going to get more out of the agreement, it means other countries are going to get less, which means it's going to be very hard to sell to their own domestic parliaments that we're doing the United States a big favour by giving up all these other things so that they can join the TPP. Just think it through, people, right? It's not hard. So that, we hope the United States will rethink the issue. In the meantime, China and Asia are looking at trade agreements, Asia for Asia. Simple as that. And RCEP is the manifestation of that. We cannot hold back. There are no speed limiters that we can impose on the Asian economy because, quite frankly, the drive to prosperity is not just economic, it is political. It is political. And if it's political, it ends up having consequences if you fail to get there, which everyone is all too familiar with. Finally, I'll just make this point. It's a bit lost in history. But the Lend-Lease agreement out of the United States, the 1940s, wasn't just about Britain. It was actually about China as well. The two countries that were the beneficiaries of it. And that illustrates that the engagement of the United States with China is not a newfound thing. It's actually got its, not its genesis, but a key part of its component input is actually out of the revolution in China, and goes right back many, many years, over centuries, in fact. So it's not a choice about the United States engaging with Asia or with China. They actually end up doing it no matter what. Otherwise, they are absenting themselves from prosperity, which is certainly not in the American DNA.
And thank you, Joe, for acknowledging Ambassador Grosser's presence, given his central role in the TPP. It's been born of much experience on his own part as a New Zealand trade representative going back to the Mesolithic period. I think that's right, Tim. The pre-Mesolithic, Paleolithic period. Ashok, we had a question from a young man at the front,
Yes.
and this will be the last one. By the way, I should announce to the panel, given all of their ambassadorial positions, I'll take the flak on the incoming Taiwan question. So as I'm the only one not representing a government here. So Ashok, your thought on the young gentleman's question about TPP advocacy or its content in the public political discourse here in DC.
Yeah, thank you. And Jack's been following this a long time around the city. TPP is a good agreement. It has been a hard negotiated agreement over more than 8 years. Countries have made concessions, and most of these concessions have been made to the United States. Wendy here was one of the toughest negotiators. Ask the Japanese. We all had to make concessions to the US. We all moved up to the United States standards.
You should try working with her now. It's tough.
I'm sure. But maybe you're right, Jack, that we didn't quite explain this thing quite effectively to people. That they have seen global trading arrangements, They see bilateral trading arrangements, and Australia, Korea, and Singapore all have bilateral trading arrangements with the United States. And we haven't quite explained that in today's modern economic relationships, that regional trading arrangements have become very important. There are regional supply chains that we tend to forget about because we see trade as one country to another country without recognizing that inputs come from one place, get sorted out and moved on to second place and third place and fourth place. We forget about how trading, what we call FTAs, are no longer just free trade arrangements, but they talk about services and standards, because we are now talking about bits and bytes and not physical containers moving across oceans. And we haven't quite explained that the TPP is this future-looking agreement. And I think that's where I hope that the incoming administration will have an opportunity to look at it, to understand that the US is fundamentally important for any regional economic arrangement. Because, as Joe says, it's a security and strategic reason that why the TPP is important, because it places the US as an anchor in the economic arrangements. I think that's quite critical to understand, because without the US leading the way, why would any country want to make any adjustments in standards? Because it is the US saying, this is good for you, and we understand, but they're putting across a pace of change that is uncomfortable for all of us. The other 11 parties have had to make uncomfortable changes. These are not easy things to do, but we're doing it because it offers us an opportunity to engage with the United States. So I think that if we relook at the TPP and represent it as being much more beneficial to the United States. Unfortunately, the language of the political election campaign, which went on for a little bit too long, both sides came out against the TPP because it was an easy three-letter word to criticize. But I think that once we start looking at it, and those of us who've been involved in it, would like to see it come back. What more important than all of this, we'd like to see the US really have a role in whatever regional economic arrangement there is. How we sell it, we'll come back to the press for advice how better to do it in this era of social media.
Good. Just to answer or attempt to answer the question on China-Taiwan, and then 30 seconds apiece for the ambassadors to close on their two recommendations for the Trump administration. China-Taiwan, here's a few thoughts. One, I think it's really important for people in the United States and in China and in Taiwan to suck in a very deep breath, calm down, and we should all stop hyperventilating over this. I think there is a danger that simply through extravagant language from the commentariat, that this has turned into something much bigger than hopefully it actually is in substance. That's my first point. And I've been studying this relationship for 30, 35 years. In politics, out of politics, as a diplomat, as a prime minister, as a scholar. And I've seen its ebbs and flows over the decades. It's very important that we cease to hyperventilate. Remember, mid-90s, we had a full-blown Taiwan Straits crisis involving US carrier deployments in the South China Sea and around Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. And secondly, we had, of course, the downing of the US aircraft in 2001, which created a separate crisis, though not specifically Taiwan-related, in the US-China relationship. It's important, as my good friend from Korea reminded us, to take an historical perspective. Now, that's my first overall statement. The second is, for all of us who are engaged with the People's Republic of China, whether it's Australia or whether it's Singapore or whether it's the Republic of Korea and others, we do so on the basis of the One China policy. That actually forms the foundation for all other discussions to occur. For the United States, it's entirely legitimate for the United States incoming administration to take a different view from Beijing on the question of the South China Sea, on the question of the East China Sea, on North Korea, on trade policy, even on questions of currency, which have been articulated during the campaign. But my word of counsel would be that the foundation stone upon which those policy discussions occur between each country and the People's Republic of China is the One China policy. I suppose my final observation is this, is that Taiwan, for which I have a genuine soft spot, I was a student there, way back in the Paleolithic period, Tim. And so I know the place well. I like it a lot, and it's really become this modern, robust place, full of innovation and full of its own democratic spirit. But I think our friends in Taipei need to be cautious about how they wish to pursue this a whole lot further. This is a very delicate relationship, very delicate. Those of you with a memory for what was like under the presidency of Chen Shui-bian, when he was president of Taiwan, we were constantly riding at the edge of a crisis. I don't think the good people of Taiwan and their aspirations for their own democratic space and for their own economic growth and for their own international space want to see this erupt into something which actually creates a bigger problem than need be the case. But I conclude with my remark. I think we are barely a month into an administration which hasn't been sworn in yet. Okay, there's another month to go, and as you know, the personnel are being appointed. So let's just all take in a deep breath and not create crises and the appearance of crises and the need for political reaction unnecessarily in what is historically a deeply delicate and most fundamental of relationships. So, 2 words of advice, Ashok, for the incoming Trump administration, with all the appropriate diplomatic caveats. Over to you.
I'll just stick to one piece of advice. I think that it'll be useful to have an early meeting of the president with Asian leaders. Whether it is in the region or to invite the Southeast Asian leaders over here. I think it'll be useful to get that conversation going because that's an important part of engaging with Asia. Having a regular conversation and starting it early may be useful.
Good one. Ambassador An.
My 2 points can be summed up in one single sentence, which is to continue to play the leadership role globally and in Asia. So that will be one single sentence. And then as a matter of fact, Kevin, you're absolutely right in the sense that transition period is already one month old, and then there is still 1 month old, another 1 month to go. But at the same time, there are many indications already, which is about which we could be, in a sense, predicting that in fact this is something which is going to happen, which is that the new incoming government will continue to play the leadership role globally as well as in our region in Asia. How do I know that? Why are they talking about so much about increasing the defense spending? Why are they talking so much about increasing the number of naval vessels from 200-something to 350? I think it is one manifestation of expressing their willingness, intention to stay engaged and continue to play the leadership role. So far, I feel good.
Okay. Ambassador An feels good. How are you feeling, Ashok? Feeling pretty good, Joe? How are you feeling?
I'm great.
2 thoughts from you, Joe?
2 thoughts from me.
Yes, mate. I'm not letting you off completely.
Okay. Number one, the best negotiator is someone that starts negotiations putting themselves into the shoes of the people they're negotiating with. And if this administration does that, I think all will be good. The second point is America has the deepest, broadest, most sophisticated democracy in the world. And I don't say that flippantly because, frankly, to have, 60 million people decide on the candidates before the election. And every little town hall, every little school right across this massive country had people standing in one corner of the room for one candidate, another corner of the room for another, and there'd be advocates saying, you've got to vote for X for the nomination, and they'd be working it out. That is unbelievable. And the scrutiny of the candidates is second to none. I mean, there was more coverage in Australia of the US election than there was of the Australian election. So I have great faith in US democracy.
About that, but I won't.
I have enormous faith in the checks and balances that the US has to deal with the diversity of the views. And frankly, I would urge everyone just to be calm, to be focused, to be honest, but also at the same time to remain just respectful. Because frankly, from my own political experience, You change channels when people are just criticizing you all the time, right? You change channel. And the people you are prepared to get advice from are the people you trust.
Wise words there, Joe. To add my 30 seconds myself on this, it would be, one, as you just said, put yourself in the position of others, which actually underpins the rationale for this entire project today, which is understanding reality seen through the lens of various capitals in the region. And the second is building on Ashok's point, which is a very practical one. In the Asia-Pacific region and in Asia proper, as we said before, symbols matter. If there's an early visit by President Trump to the region, it'd be good to see him in Japan and Korea and Beijing. Good to see him give a speech in Singapore, my friend, in terms of his views of the future of Southeast Asia, maybe down under as well. But I think where he goes will be watched with intense scrutiny given the nature of what has unfolded during the election campaign. Our Middle Eastern European colleagues will have different views, but that's for another day. Could you please put your hands together and thank our three ambassadors.
Congratulations.
And as they say in the cartoons, folks, that's all from us, folks.
Your Excellency.